Hi, Dr. P here to talk at some length about ways to reduce the length of combat resolution in tabletop games and consequently reduce the length of the game itself, especially how to use deterministic combat or tables. My experience with Britannia is that the players can spend a lot of time rolling dice. You roll one die for each army in a fight, and a 5 or a 6 generally eliminates an opposing army. But if the attacker is attacking into difficult terrain, then they need a 6. And sometimes, especially if there aren't very many armies involved and neither side decides to retreat, the dice rolling can go on for quite a while. I also have a number of prototypes that I've experimented with different kinds of combat, especially deterministic combat or combat that uses tables rather than rolling a bunch of dice. Now I have a 3-part series on deterministic versus stochastic combat in my course Strategic Wargame Design, but you've got to sign up for the course and it's not yet available. Here we're primarily interested in ways to make the combat go faster. It doesn't need to be deterministic. It can use a table for one roll per side, which is independent, or even just one die roll, a dependent version of combat. In general, you have two choices when trying to speed up the combat in a game that uses a lot of dice. One is to use deterministic combat rather than dice. The other is to use a dice table so that one roll, or one roll by each player, determines the outcome. In either case, unfortunately, you have to leave out opportunities to retreat during the battle before the result is decided, and that's a big deal. On the other hand, you have extremes like Axis and Allies and Shogun, where the defender cannot retreat ever. So there are different ways to go about this. Now, some people might say that deterministic combat, where you can always figure out what the result is going to be, this assumes that there's not some way to hide the identity of the pieces coming into the battle. It can feel sterile, or it cannot feel sterile. It depends on the game. I've had games where I've switched from deterministic to a simple dice version and vice versa. And sometimes either one works pretty well. Now in Britannia, for example, if you wanted to use deterministic combat, you could say each army inflicts a hit, and 3 hits are needed to kill an army. In difficult terrain, then you've got a different situation, and I'm not sure how you would do it because I don't use deterministic combat in Britannia, and not any of the versions of Britannia. The result of this method is fewer armies will be eliminated because they die at the full of hits point when they've received however many hits it takes to kill them, and never earlier. Now, to more generalize about this, when you use deterministic combat, a certain number destroys an opponent, say 3. If only 1 or 2 hits have been inflicted, that is less than needed to eliminate, then these hits continue to count through the next sessions of combat. Also, hits cannot be spread across several units. They all have to go on one unit until it dies. Wounded units cannot retreat unless all of that side retreats. Wounds are wiped away when the entire battle ends. You don't have to keep track. If you're using figures, it's pretty easy to lay one down to show that it's wounded. If you're using flat pieces, it's a little more difficult. Now, I want to interject at this point that F.W. Lanchester's World War I research showed that in melee, army strength is proportional to their numbers, which is the kind of method I've been talking about. But in the age of firepower, strength is proportional to the square of their numbers, because the action of firepower at a distance. I usually avoid squares because a lot of people are going to have problems with calculating that kind of thing, and I just stick with proportional to numbers, even in a space war game where it's all firepower. Now, dice tables are quick, but they don't require calculation or arithmetic. And by a dice table, I mean You roll one die, you have results 1 through 6, and across the main part of the table you have the number of armies involved, and you cross-index the die roll with the number of armies involved, and that's how many you kill or how many hits you inflict, as the case may be. What you can do with dice tables is, for example, reduce the standard deviation so that less is subject to chance. Now that assumes one roll on the table, and then whoever took greater damage loses the battle. If you roll through separate sessions, you're not really saving much time. Remember, the idea here is to save time, and for that you need a table that you roll one die, or each player rolls one die, and that's all. The battle is decided. So I take it design by design. Sometimes two methods will work, and you can make one an option and the other the standard. War games in general have lots of options. I know some kinds of games these days don't have options until the expansion comes out, and some do, but in war games people are happy with options and sometimes even expect optional rules. Thanks for listening.